Hello and welcome to the Two Matts and a Jeff podcast. Matt Moyer along with Jeff Moyer and Matt Bannon. We're just some middle-aged guys talking some sports, and today our topic is the NCAA men's basketball tournament, and we're looking at the best teams of all time. So not an overall, but a year and a specific team, and which one was the best. So we have our lists and our rankings, and I'm going to start this list off. My number 5, in the top 5 list of NCAA men's basketball teams, I selected the 2012 Kentucky Wildcats. They were 38-2. I look for, on a great team, success, of course. I think in order to be in the top, you have to win a lot of games, but you got to win the game. If you don't win the last game, you're not making the top 5. And there were some great teams that didn't quite make it there, but they did. And they won more games than any other team ever. 38 games. You know, I don't know how they packed their schedule full of that, but that's more games than any other team that won in a given season.
Yeah, more opportunities now than ones back then. But yeah,
true. Yeah. So I also look at some great players to see. Every one of these teams has some great players. This particular team has 2 guys that Anthony Davis, who you certainly could say is one of the best college athletes and pro basketball players right now. Michael Kidd Gilchrist was another guy on the team. 38 wins. They were 16-0 in the SEC, 19-0 at home. 344 blocks, the most in NCAA history. Wow. This team had, which I thought was pretty impressive because that's a statistic that doesn't often get in there on things. So I thought that was interesting. I like and they beat the number 6 Kansas team to win the NCAA tournament that year. So they were. Oh, one last thing about that team that I would mention is they were either 1, 2, or 3 all season. So there's something to be said for starting low and working your way up. But this was a team that stayed high all season in the rankings.
Had high expectations and maintained them.
Yes.
Right.
So,
okay. Well, I'm going to go back a ways with my number 5. Don't know much about them. San Francisco Dons.
Oh, man.
1956. And the person you'll recognize the name from the San Francisco Dons was Bill Russell's team. And of course, they were national champs. They went undefeated. They were 29-0. And, again, the big player, of course, was Bill Russell. He averaged a double-double, over 20 points, over 21 points per game, and over 20 rebounds per game. As I was looking at my list, I'm like, there was a lot of undefeateds. Well, not a lot, but enough undefeateds. I'm like, where am I going to put some of these teams? And as I was doing some more reading, I'm thinking I'm just going to put them in there. So I don't know too much more about them.
So I'll just very honorable mention. I'll tag team on. I'll tag team on that. And when reading up on them, I found out that I don't know if a lot of guys know who Casey Jones is.
Right.
He played for the Celtics. Was a Celtics coach in the '80s.
Oh, yeah.
For a little while when Larry Bird was there, and he was on that team, but was ruled. Let me get it right here. For the NCAA tournament that year, he was ruled ineligible. So they didn't even have. He's their second best player. They didn't even have him, and they still went undefeated.
That is impressive.
So I thought it was an interesting stat.
And it speaks a lot of the team.
Yeah.
Yes.
Next man up.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Right. Okay, so my number 5 was the 1982 North Carolina Tar Heels. They were 32-2, won the title. Most people, at least our age, know famously on Michael Jordan's jump shot against Georgetown in the final. 12 future NBA draft picks on that roster. I'm not sure a lot of them played a lot of time, but
there was a few that did though.
But MJ, obviously, James Worthy was their leading scorer because MJ, I believe, was only a freshman that year. So he averaged around 15 a game. They had Sam Perkins. Their point guard was a point guard back in the day. I mean, I'm older than you guys. I remember the point guard Jimmy Black, an exceptional point guard, and of course coached by Dean Smith. I just think their squad in general. I think they could even compete today against teams today, which says a lot because the game's completely different. Although I think athleticism. I don't know about 3-point shooting. They would have to make an adjustment, obviously, the way games play today. But
because there's no reason to shoot from way out there. So you didn't practice those because why take a 2 from that far out?
Right, exactly. Right. So anyhow, so 82 Tar Heels are my number.
Well, the one thing you got to mention with that team, Matt, is what is it they say about Dean Smith and Michael Jordan?
Oh, he's the only Dean Smith's the only person to contain Michael
The
Jordan.
only person to keep Michael Jordan under 20 points a game was Dean Smith. Great, one of the greatest coaches of all time.
Yeah.
So they may have made my list, but they're not my number 4. So my number 4 team was 1976 Indiana, coached by Bobby Knight. 32-0, so undefeated, and they were number 1 all season from the beginning of the season. Yes,
Yeah, wow.
they
Did not know
their
that.
ranking. When you look at their record, they were number 1 the entire season. They beat Michigan in the title game by 20 points. And you know, the biggest name I found on that roster that I knew was Quinn Buckner. There were, you know, a couple other, you know, good starters and stuff, but you know, again, that's before my time. I was 3 years old when that happened. Actually, 2 really. So it's before my time, but you know, that's impressive. And I think when you can go undefeated and be the number 1 team all year and never lose your number 1 ranking, you know, that sustained greatness. There's something to be said for that.
Okay. My number 4 is actually, I can remember winning a pool with this team, and it was the Duke team of 1992. 34-2, of course, national champs. And what made that also more impressive was they were already the defending national champs. So they already had a bullseye on their back, I should say. And that was also their 3rd straight championship game that they were in. And the only 2 losses they had all year, they had lost to UNC only by 2 points earlier in the year, and Wake Forest by 4 points. So, you know, they weren't undefeated, but, you know, they're pretty much as close as you can get. A lot of your great names of the people you probably couldn't stand on Duke, you know, with Christian Leitner. So, but yes, I have the 1992 Duke Blue Devils.
Again, we don't compare lists beforehand, but my number 4 is the 1992 Duke Blue Devils. Let's see, 6 future NBA players beat the Fab Five. If you know who they are, going back.
If you don't,
press
pause and go look them up. Come on.
Fab Five from
The big
Michigan.
shorts.
Yes, by 20 points in the final. You know, you mentioned Christian Leitner averaged 21 a game. Grant Hill, who I think, if not injuries in the pro, would be regarded as a much higher as far as overall basketball player all time. And of course, the ultimate point guard and distributor, Bobby Hurley, and Coach K. You know, one of the best coaches of all time in college or whatever. And of course, Leitner shot against Kentucky in overtime at the Spectrum in the Elite Eight. Just that helps as far as putting where they go on my list.
Well, I like that team so much that they're my number 3 team. So you already pretty much said everything that I would say. I think I guess one little stat I had down is they won their first 17 games, you know, in a row. You know, beat some big time teams, which you mentioned. You know, they beat Kentucky, they beat Michigan, the Fab Five.
Well, plus they played, you know, in the ACC, and at that time was definitely, stacked.
Stealing my thunder. That was definitely a big one.
Well,
No, I mean, like you're right though. I mean, at that time, the ACC was where all the great teams were, and you know, to go through that. And their 2 losses were to ACC teams. To go through that all season is not easy for any team. So they really had to go through a lot to get there. And, you know, you mentioned it before. They're coming off of a title win. So to repeat is exceptionally difficult. It's only been done a few times. So, and to me, there's some history there. Like that team, 1992, that's a year that I was, you know, watching more basketball than I was in 1976, you know, and so there's a lot, you know, that it was very enjoyable. So that might bring it up on my list to number 3 above some others because of that. So who's your number 3?
All right, so my number 3, you have to pick from this one team. I'm sure a lot of you have at least one. UCLA, and I picked 1967. So again, right before my time. They were 30-0, won the national championship, of course. That was Lou Alcindor at the time. At the time, that was, which I didn't realize, that was Lou Alcindor's only undefeated season. So they won 3 titles with him because they couldn't win 4 because they didn't let freshmen play.
Right.
Those of you that are listening, you guys know that, but you know, that's always interesting, I think, to bring up that, you know, he probably would have won 4 in a row or whatever, but couldn't because he couldn't even play. Lou Alcindor averaged 29 points per game, 15 rebounds per game. So I got the 1967 UCLA Bruins.
That's so fun. So I have the 1968 UCLA Bruins as my number 3. They weren't undefeated. They're 29-1. They had lost. Their only loss during the season was to the Houston Cougars, University of Houston Cougars, in the Alamo Dome against Elvin Hayes, and that's by 2. And then they played them again in the Final Four and beat them by 101-69. So I think they avenged the loss just a little bit. Obviously, Lou Alcindor had 26 a game. John Wooden, as you mentioned with UCLA, between Lou Alcindor's time there and another player who might come up time there, you could sort of pick and choose or whatever. But the fact that that they avenged that loss, I thought was a big thing, because that game, like back in the day, I was born a year or 2 before this happened or whatever, but that was like televised, I think, in color from the Astrodome. It was like a huge event. It was like an Ali fight that we talked about on a previous podcast.
The Astrodome.
Yeah.
So think about that. The basketball game in the Astrodome. So think about how many seats that is on what would be the baseball field before you even get to the stands.
And back then, they didn't do it like they do now when they do in the big, like, Lucas Oil Stadium or in Indianapolis or anything, but they're going to have the Final Four this year. They didn't have, like, whatever. They just put it in the middle and everybody had to sit in where the baseball and football stands, so anyhow.
So, some great teams there in UCLA for sure. My number 2 team, though, it was on you already mentioned, which was the 1982 UNC team that you already mentioned. And you mentioned a lot of great things about that team. I think that, again, when I think of great teams, I think of great coaches. Dean Smith is in the, top 10 of best coaches perhaps ever in any sport, I think. They beat a great team in the Georgetown Hoyas with my man Patrick Ewing, for the title, which I think is another thing when you got to go through a lot to get there. There are teams that when they get to the title game, they went through a lot, but the team they're playing maybe isn't as great. So I think sometimes that brings them down. But this team didn't have that. They had to play a great team, and they were playing again in the ACC. That's really tough. They were number 1 or 2 all season. Great players, and one player that you mentioned, but I don't think the kids these days don't know how good James Worthy really was.
Oh, yeah.
I know Jeff was a big James Worthy fan, and he was the best player on that team that year, above Michael Jordan, who was just a freshman. But James Worthy was an incredible player, and I don't think gets enough credit that he should. So there you go. The 82 UNC team is my number 2 team of all time.
My number 2 team was mentioned already. Indiana, 1976. Of course, national champs, 32-0. They were the last undefeated champ to go. So we'll see what happens maybe this year with Gonzaga. But, that was, so think about that. That's the last time in 1976.
Long time.
Yeah. When I think of Indiana, I think of Bobby Knight. As you mentioned, I believe earlier, Matt, they didn't have, at least to my knowledge, maybe you would know better, but the iconic player, Scott May was their best player, averaged 24 points a game.
Right.
I would never known that. Until I looked it up, I would never known that. They had 3 All-Americans on that team, though. So that was, I think what made them really special at the time was, 3 All-Americans. So my number 2, Indiana.
My number 2 is the 76 Indiana Hoosiers as well. 32-0. We've talked about it extensively or whatever. Let's see. They won their NCAA tournament games by an average of 13 points. That shows some dominance there. Did you mention Kent Benson as well? Kent Benson was another star on their team, and I guess a guy named Bob. I've heard of Kent Benson, Scott May, and Quinn Buckner. And Quinn Buckner is by far the most famous that I can remember.
Right, for me too, yeah.
And there's another guy named Bob Wilkerson, I guess, who was a good player, really good player for them. And another thing I had noted from them, they had 4 players, that not in 1 year, but they had 4 players that were selected at number 11 or higher in the NBA draft. So that,
especially back then.
Right. It wasn't a lottery or
right.
whatever. Right. So, but yeah, the Hoosiers were, and Bob Knight, of course, and the Hoosiers were my number 2.
So we're to my number 1, and you'll notice that UCLA was not in my list anywhere else. And here's where I guess I go a little rogue because I'm going to say the 1967 to 1973 UCL team.
Wait, no,
UCLA
violation.
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 Yes. You call. I was waiting for you to call it out. I wasn't going to call it myself. It is a violation, but I could. This is where I really struggled when I was looking at these teams and which team to put in. And if you kids don't know, the UCLA basketball program under John Wooden, who is maybe the best basketball coach ever, and one of the best human beings ever, incredible man, incredible coach. This team had 7 straight titles. 7 straight titles. They were undefeated in 66, 67, 68, and from 71 to 74, undefeated again. So that kind of dominance. So I lumped them all together. I'm cheating on my number one and putting them all together because I couldn't pick just one out. I'll call
I only put 2 players on my list.
You mentioned Lou Alcindor, of course.
Just don't take all the thunder away.
All right, I won't take all the thunder away. But a couple things. So Bill Walton, another big name, of course. In '72, they defeated. They won by an average of 30.3 points a game. An average of 30.3 points a game, average margin of victory. So that tells you if they had a couple that they won by 10, how many were they beating people by? I don't know. But anyway, just complete dominance of that team and unheard of. You just mentioned no one's gone undefeated and win the title since 1976. These guys did it year after year after year. Just incredible. And so I lumped them all together, and I'll take it, but to say that, like, those UCLA teams, and they're all before my time. I wasn't born for most of these things. Actually, I wasn't born for any of them. If I was 67 to 73, I wasn't born for any of them. But that kind of dominance hasn't been seen since, and don't know that it ever will.
No, it can't.
It can't be because, you mentioned, Jeff, that freshmen couldn't play. Well, now there are guys who only play when they're freshmen and you never see them again. So to be able to string that together is probably impossible. So there you go. UCLA from 1967 to 1973 is the greatest team of all time, an NCAA basketball team.
All right. Well, I'm only taking one of those teams. I had picked the 1972 UCLA Bruins, 30-0, national champs, won by over 30 points a game that year. Bill Walton, average double-double. You can think of the iconic beard and, all of that. Not much more else to say. But I think about, again, those of you that are younger, if you're watching, those players, they had kids that stayed in school and played. So, you're just not going to have that here, anymore unless you're watching, a smaller program.
When you look at all those teams that, that I just mentioned, there's 2 names that are like big time. Right. Most of the other guys on those teams are not guys that I readily knew. Right. So they're putting together a team sport, which is if you know anything about John Wooden, you know what he put together. So didn't happen by accident.
No, just piggyback. 72 Bruins are my number one as well. They only had 2 games that they won by single digits, and actually one of them, I believe, was in the finals by 5. But they just beat Florida State by 5 in the final. And Walton famously had said that he played awful and they should have won by way more ease, I believe was the quote. 5th in scoring, 8th in points allowed. But definitely look up John Wooden. I mean, not just for basketball coach, but for life coach.
Oh, yeah.
If you really want for improvement or whatever. So.
Yeah, absolutely. John Wooden, incredible human being, for sure. So I guess, a couple honorable mentions. I only have a couple. And actually, literally a couple, too. And both of these teams were great teams, but they lost their last game. Okay. And so that's why they didn't get put up a little bit higher, but pretty incredible teams. The first is 1991 UNLV that went 34-1, but they lost the title game. The running Rebs, and at that time, if you were watching basketball, college basketball, they were hot thing to watch, and they were one of those teams that kind of transcended basketball. Tark, the coach, chewing on his towel and everything else. And then the other team that I had to include, the Phi Slamma Jamma 1983 Houston team. If you don't know that team, you should. It's got Hakeem Olajuwon, it's got Clyde the Glide Drexler, and they just Phi Slamma Jamma. They dunked the ball. They won a lot of basketball games, 31-3. So they lost a couple. They lost the last game of the season to
NC State.
NC State, yes, under Jim Valvano. Just if you watch that game, just an incredible. Anyone could have won that game at the end with how things went. The story on the other side is such a great story that you can't even hold that against them. But a great Houston team there.
Well, I wrote a bunch down, but a bunch we already mentioned was the 82 North Carolina team. And then I put a couple of the undefeateds, North Carolina from 1957, 32-0. So they had, we had talked about, I guess it was football when you guys got on me because I didn't put the Miami Dolphins because they went undefeated. Right. So I'm thinking when I looked things up, I didn't realize there were 7 teams that went undefeated and won a title. So I have a couple of those on the UCLA teams from 73 and 64. I have Kentucky's 96. I believe somebody had. Did they not have?
No, I had 2012.
Okay, well they were 34-2, national champ. NC State from 1974. They were 30-1. And then I did put the very end, but again because they lost UNLV, and in fact. Again, going back to a pool, I remember where I won because I was a Duke person, and I had Duke winning, and people couldn't believe I had Duke beating UNLV. So, but I did. So.
Everyone else in the pool probably had UNLV.
Yeah.
All right, just a few that I think you covered a lot. Like I had the '96 Wildcats, such a deep squad, 9 NBA players, won their 20 games by an average of 21. I had the San Francisco Dons team that you had mentioned. We talked about. I had the '66 UTEP Miners. Were 28-1, first team ever to start 5 black starters, and beat Kentucky famously in the final.
There was a huge powerhouse that Kentucky was
right and completely disrespected. UTEP Miners, they were actually Texas Western at that point or whatever. If you want to watch a good movie, Glory Road is based on that. Don Haskins is the coach, Bobby Joe Hill and Willie Worsley were their best players. So they were groundbreaking as well as excellent. Another one that I had was the '74 NC State Wolfpack, David Thompson, and a guy,
high flyer,
and then 7-footer Tom Burleson. They beat UCLA in double overtime in the NCAA semis, and that was right around the time that UCLA's dominance came to an end. And then the last team I have was also the team you mentioned, the '57 Tar Heels, and they actually won the title in triple overtime against Wilt Chamberlain in Kansas. So.
Well, I think it's going to be at least in my top 5, there was no newer team, and I'm looking at my honorable mention was 2012. I think when you look back, even nowadays, it's going to be very hard to say this is a team of teams, right? Because you just don't, you don't have those guys staying anymore. And
right. Well, and listen, in a couple of years, some of these guys could jump right to the G League,
right? And
they won't even go to college. So college basketball, the landscape of it is changing. And it's going to be hard to get that kind of domination for more than you could get lucky in a year and go undefeated or something, but it's going to be hard to see that kind of domination. And I don't think you'll ever see the domination that UCLA had.
No.
Not in my lifetime. I doubt it. It's impossible almost. Yeah. So, well, there you go, gang. There you have it. Our top NCAA men's basketball teams of all time. You've been watching and listening to the Two Matts and a Jeff podcast. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We will see you next time.